Joe came to the farm in 1890 at the age of 35. Unable to read and write, he was diagnosed by the county doctor to be simple minded, but his carpentry skills and willingness to work proved invaluable over the years. Many young inmates left after a short time, as no one was forced to stay, but Joe had found his home and chose to live on the farm for 46 years. When the water system was updated in 1898, Joe designed and built the shelter covering the smokehouse and water barrel, which still stands today. He was a quiet, easygoing man who assisted the stewards whenever needed, being one of those inmates that received pay later on for his labor. In the 1920s, he spent a lot of time with the new steward's young boys, even painting pinstripes on Irvin's bicycle. Due to the stigma surrounding the poor farm at the time, residents were often the recipients of scorn. One evening, a truck stopped on the road in front of the homestead, and Jack and Ringer, the boys' two dogs, ran to the end of the lane barking when the occupants began to shout taunts. Gunshots rang out in the coming darkness, and the boys sprang to life, retrieving and firing their hunting guns at the fading taillights. Come morning, they found one of their faithful companions dead in the lane, and the other at the foot of the hayloft steps in the stable, where it had drug itself before dying. Old Joe helped bury the animals and comforted the boys by saying that the inmates were content on the farm and not to compound the problem with anger or revenge. He then admitted the secret that he was a long-term inmate, not the hired hand he had stated, and that he would not have stayed if he felt intimidated by what outsiders thought. He admitted that if one of the perpetrators were to come on to the farm itself and cause trouble, he would be the first to take care of the problem. Until then, they could be ignored. The boys looked up in surprise at the simple minded man who frequently sat silently on the porch, tracing the grain in a piece of wood with his finger for hours. As his words sunk in, the anger subsided and they realized the truth of his sentiment. One day, at the age of 81, old Joe did not come downstairs to breakfast. The loss of his kindness and simple wisdom touched everyone on the farm, and he was laid to rest in the city cemetery. It was the sheriff's duty to bring new inmates to the farm, and in 1894 this task proved very unpleasant. Loud oaths had been heard coming from the prone man in the wagon the whole trip from the hospital, who was in obvious pain. The hospital staff had informed the sheriff that Robert was admitted fully intoxicated, cursing and vomiting, and it was quite evident from his appearance that the man spent most of his time that way. The only information available was that the man of color had been born in Virginia to slavery, and since acquiring his freedom had been drifting alone, a liquor bottle his only companion. Fletcher tried to make the man comfortable on the farm, but when asking Robert his name, he received Nigger Bob as an answer among another flurry of curses. It had seemed, even with his freedom from slavery, work was impossible to find, leading to a life of vagrancy and drink. Despite his pleas, the steward refused alcohol, and Robert was far too ill to leave. When the sheriff returned 8 days later and asked about the patient, the steward's face held the answer. He consoled the law officer by saying that Robert had finally gained the freedom he had so desperately sought, and the sheriff had to sadly agree. He was laid to rest in the farm's pasture cemetery. On Halloween 1894, the sheriff brought another patient to the farm, but instead of entering the homestead, went directly to the sick house sitting in the middle of the property. The young father was stricken with typhoid and was refused treatment at the city hospital due to the possibility of exposure to the public. Under the county doctor's supervision, the stewardess attended the patient, who was fighting hard to recover and return to his family. Over the next week, his condition worsened despite the stewardess's best efforts, and she was saddened by the arrival of Charles' wife, Bridget, and their 3 children, who also had taken ill. Fearing contaminating her own family and others living at the homestead, the stewardess spent most of her time at the sick house tending to the stricken family. Her husband and other inmates took over her duties, and Fletcher would travel to the sick house several times a day to deliver food, clothing, and medication. Mrs. Fletcher spent the next 3 weeks growing close to the pioneer family, hearing tales of Bridget's beloved Ireland and her wonderment upon reaching the shores of America, where she fell in love with Charles. Shortly after their marriage, they moved to Nebraska, where first one, then another daughter was born. It was just a year prior to that, a son, Charles Jr., was added to the family. Despite all efforts, Charles' spirit slipped away on December 17th, and his family followed a few days later. Heartbroken, the stewardess returned to the homestead. The sheriff visited the farm one morning in 1895 and was offered a cup of coffee after helping the young man who accompanied him through the kitchen door to a chair by the table. He set the steaming mug in front of Frank as he adjusted another chair under the man's bandaged leg and explained to the steward that the visitor needed shelter and care until he was back on both feet. The young man took a deep breath now that the trip was over and the pain in his left knee had subsided. He looked up hopefully to the stewardess, and she quickly prepared a light meal, as Frank's tattered clothing did little to disguise his need of nourishment. With Fletcher's prodding, Frank stumbled through his story of leaving home in search of adventure by way of freight trains, and the sheriff raised an eyebrow now and then with the newfound information. He told of how he twisted his knee jumping from a train that had reached Fremont, and as the stewardess helped him upstairs to a waiting bed, the sheriff gave him a wink to let him know he would not report the incident to the railroad. After a week of bed rest and nourishment, Frank left the farm, hopeful to settle in the area. In 1897, Gus and Emma sought refuge at the poor farm while Gus actively looked for work. The newly German immigrants had spent the last of their money to come west. They longed to find a new life and needed shelter until permanent employment was secured. Full of life and dreams, they brought much needed happiness to the sanctuary at Christmas that year. Work was found in the new year, and the couple left the farm a month later to begin their new life. Not all new inmates were as welcome. A 78-year-old man by the name of James entered the house in 1899. Although the steward warned him, he was discharged quickly because of his foul mouth. As much as he upset the casual order of things, it was not long before stories were laughed over about old James.